The disappearance that wasn't about you. They left quietly. No argument. No final conversation. No dramatic send-off that told you where you stood in their life. Just gone. At first, you think it's a phase. A rough patch. Maybe they need space. Maybe they're overwhelmed. Maybe you said something wrong. So you wait. And when nothing comes, no text, no call, no reason, you begin doing something you never thought you'd do. You start blaming yourself for someone else's silence. That's the hook. Because when someone ghosts you, your mind doesn't just feel pain. It seeks meaning. And where there is none, it creates a story. One that sounds like, if I had been different, they would have stayed. But here's the truth. They didn't ghost you because you were too much. They ghosted you because you asked for more than they were able to give. Not because you were needy, not because you were broken, but because, on some level, your presence pressed on a part of them they've spent years trying to avoid. Vulnerability, intimacy, real emotional responsibility. To them, closeness is not safe. It's threatening. And when it gets too close, they don't negotiate, they vanish. And not because they don't feel anything, but because they feel too much and have no idea what to do with it. You didn't imagine the connection. You didn't fabricate the way they looked at you, the moments they held you, the depth you thought you saw behind their quiet eyes. Avoidantly attached people do feel intensely, even, but their conditioning taught them one rule. Don't need anyone. Don't depend. Don't stay too long. And whatever you do, don't let someone see how much you care. So they protect themselves in the only way they know how: silence. It's not to hurt you. It's to survive the terror of being emotionally known. But that doesn't mean their silence didn't hurt. It did. It does. Because the pain of being ghosted isn't just the absence of words. It's the absence of worth. It tells you, you weren't even worth a goodbye. But listen to me. Ghosting is not proof of your insignificance. It's evidence of their emotional incapacity. They couldn't end it like a grown adult, because that would require confronting their own fear, guilt, shame, and conflict. So instead, they disappear and leave you holding the grief. But that grief, it's sacred. It's not weakness. It's your nervous system coming out of shock. It's your body mourning not just them, but the illusion of safety you thought you had with them. They weren't the safe place you thought they were. And that's what you're really grieving. Not just the person, but the fantasy that you'd finally found someone who wouldn't leave. Someone who would stay. Someone who could meet you in your depth. That's why it stings so deeply, especially if you're someone with anxious or ambivalent attachment patterns. Their sudden disconnection doesn't just break your heart. It threatens your sense of stability in the world. But what if I told you? They didn't ghost you because you're too much. They ghosted you because your very presence made them feel too exposed. And when you finally understand that, a subtle shift happens. You stop taking their silence personally, and you start seeing it for what it is. Avoidance isn't rejection. It's fear disguised as indifference. Why avoidance leave when the connection feels real? You may not know this, but the more real your connection became, the more likely they were to run, not less. Because for the avoidantly attached, intimacy doesn't bring comfort. It brings threat. It's a strange paradox. They want closeness, but they fear what closeness demands. To be seen, to be known, to be emotionally accountable. And they've spent years, sometimes lifetimes, training themselves not to feel, to rely on themselves, to push others away when things get intense, to preserve control at all costs. So when someone like you comes along, someone warm, open, emotionally attuned, it activates something in them that they don't know how to name. You don't make them feel nothing. You make them feel everything. And that's the problem. Because feeling, to them, is dangerous. Maybe you noticed it. Every time you got close, they pulled back. Every time you shared a piece of yourself, they went quiet. Every time things seemed good, they sabotaged it. That's not about you. That's about a nervous system that was trained to associate connection with loss of control, or worse, loss of self. To them, emotional closeness feels like a trap. Like if they open up, they'll lose the one thing that's kept them emotionally safe all these years, distance. So they run, not because they don't care, but because staying would mean confronting the very parts of themselves they've spent years trying to bury. Here's the cruel irony. Their silence often begins right after something beautiful happens. You get vulnerable. You connect deeply. You share something raw. And the next day, they disappear. Why? Because the moment it starts to feel real is the moment they feel most unsafe. And instead of saying, "This is hard for me," they say nothing. Because saying something means making themselves visible. And to them, visibility means vulnerability. And that's the core wound. That's the truth they don't know how to speak. I want love, but I'm terrified of being fully seen in it. And maybe you sensed that. Maybe part of you knew they were fighting something inside. That they weren't trying to hurt you, even though it hurt. That they weren't cruel, just scared. But here's the thing. You can have compassion for their fear without abandoning your own needs. You can understand their nervous system without overriding your own. You can love someone deeply and still walk away. Not because you stopped caring, but because they stopped showing up. It's not your job to fix their avoidance. It's not your job to be so emotionally safe that they never get triggered. It's not your job to make them stay. That's their work. And if they're not doing it, you'll spend the entire relationship managing their fear while ignoring your pain. And that is not love. That is self-abandonment. It's hard, I know, especially when they come back later, as they often do. After weeks or months of silence, they resurface like nothing happened, like their absence wasn't devastating, like you're supposed to be grateful they returned. But by then, something in you has shifted. You've seen what their silence costs. You've felt the weight of loving someone who disappears when things get real. You've realized it's not sustainable, because love that requires you to disappear just to keep someone else close is not love. It's fear management. And you deserve more than that. You deserve to be chosen by someone whose nervous system doesn't collapse at the sight of your love. When their silence becomes your self-doubt. What they don't say echoes. Their absence becomes a loud presence. Their silence becomes a story. One your nervous system tries desperately to decode. And without answers, your mind begins to whisper the cruelest possibility. Maybe I wasn't enough. This is the poison of being ghosted by someone you loved. It doesn't just hurt. It makes you question your perception, your value, your intuition. Because when someone disappears without closure, they don't just exit your life. They leave behind a vacancy that your brain rushes to fill with blame. Maybe I misread everything. Maybe it was never real. Maybe I came on too strong. And this is how the trauma bond tightens. Not through presence, but through absence. Not through kindness, but through emotional confusion. Avoidants don't realize this. They don't understand that by ghosting you, they've triggered your most vulnerable wounds. Especially if you're someone who's ever felt abandoned, rejected, or made to feel like love was conditional. And the worst part? You start to think their withdrawal is something you deserved. Because if you were truly worthy, they wouldn't have left, right? Wrong. Avoidance ghosts not because you're unworthy, but because they feel unworthy of staying. Your openness shines a light on their inner lack. Your consistency highlights their avoidance. Your emotional availability exposes their emotional unavailability. And instead of rising to meet you, they retreat. Because retreat is familiar. Distance feels safer than dialogue. Avoidance feels more survivable than honesty. But you're left with silence. And silence, in the absence of closure, becomes internalized as self-doubt. You question your judgment. You wonder if you imagined it all. You replay the last conversation over and over, searching for the one thing you said that made them disappear. But here's the truth. There may be no last straw, no secret reason, no misstep that triggered it. Sometimes, ghosting doesn't come from anything you did. It comes from how deeply you affected them. Because when someone's default response to emotional closeness is fear, then you showing up fully can feel like a threat. They didn't ghost you because you were too much. They ghosted you because you were real. And they didn't know how to handle that. And here's what happens next. You start to shrink. You start to think, next time, I'll be quieter, softer, less vulnerable. You begin to edit your presence in the world just to avoid being ghosted again. That is how avoidance turns into a mirror of your old wounds. And that's why healing isn't just about moving on. It's about reclaiming all the parts of yourself you started suppressing after they left. Because ghosting doesn't just make you sad. It makes you smaller, if you're not careful. But here's what healing starts to sound like. I didn't deserve to be left without a word. I was loving, not needy. I was honest, not dramatic. They left because they weren't ready, not because I was unlovable. You can still miss them and know they weren't right for you. You can still have empathy for their trauma, while refusing to be collateral damage to it. You don't have to vilify them, but you also don't have to canonize them. You're allowed to say, I understand why you ghosted me, but I'm not going to carry the weight of your fear any longer. Ghosting is a wound that opens up a portal, one that leads straight into your early conditioning. It activates the part of you that was taught love needs to be earned. But the truth is, real love doesn't disappear, and it sure as hell doesn't leave you guessing. The ones who are ready don't vanish when things get close. They lean in, they reassure, they speak. And the ones who don't, that's not your fault. That's their unfinished work. Seeing it clearly, hurting a little less. There comes a moment, quiet, powerful, irreversible, when you finally stop asking why. Not because you got all the answers, but because you no longer need them to heal. The questions used to consume you. Did I say too much? Were they pretending the whole time? Was any of it real? But something inside you softens when you begin to realize, yes, it was real, but no, it wasn't sustainable. And that's the difference most people miss. You can have a real connection with someone who is emotionally unavailable. You can experience intimacy with someone who can't sustain it. You can feel love with someone who doesn't know how to stay in it. It doesn't mean you imagined it. It just means you were loving someone who couldn't love you back in the same way. And that's what makes avoidant disconnection so disorienting. They do feel, they do connect, they do care, but their caring ends at the threshold of their fear. Once love asks them to open, expand, risk, they close down. And that shutdown, that silence, that sudden exit, it's not personal. It's patterned. They've done it before. They'll do it again, until they decide to confront their inner world. But you don't need to wait for that. You don't need to pause your healing on the chance. They might return with a new heart. You can begin now, because the real work isn't about getting them back. It's about getting yourself back. The version of you that trusted, that spoke your truth, that gave wholeheartedly, that didn't shrink when someone got scared. You don't need to become colder to protect yourself. You don't need to harden your heart just to be safe. You just need to remember, Their inability to stay had nothing to do with your capacity to love. One day, you'll think about them and feel peace. Not because you forgot, but because you remembered yourself. You'll stop replaying the last message. You'll stop hoping for the apology. You'll stop searching for your worth in someone else's fear response. And in that moment, you'll realize something powerful. Their ghosting wasn't a rejection. It was a reveal. It showed you everything you needed to know. About them. About you. About the kind of love you will never settle for again. The moment you realize this wasn't about you, there's a quiet revolution that happens in the healing process. It's not loud. It's not angry. It's not a dramatic confrontation or a triumphant speech you finally deliver. It's a pause, a breath, a stillness that wraps around a single, life-changing realization. This was never about me. Their disappearance, their silence, their inability to say goodbye. It wasn't about your worth. It wasn't about how lovable you are. It wasn't about anything you failed to do. It was about their inability to cope with closeness. About their wiring, not yours. And in that moment, you stop taking it personally. You stop assigning their fear to your reflection. Because for the first time, you truly see them. Not as the mystery you were supposed to solve, but as the wounded human who never learned how to stay. You start to understand something else. You were never too much. You were just more than they were ready to hold. You were clear. They were conflicted. You were consistent. They were confused. You were present. They were afraid. And when someone is afraid of the very thing they claim to want, connection, closeness, intimacy, they run. Not because you're wrong for them, but because you challenge everything they haven't yet healed. Avoidants don't ghost because they don't care. They ghost because they don't know how to care in a way that includes vulnerability. They care until caring means opening up. They love until love asks them to stay present through discomfort. They connect until connection starts feeling like dependence. That's when the shutdown begins. Not because they're cruel, but because closeness to another person threatens their sense of control. For someone with an avoidant attachment style, independence isn't just a preference. It's a survival mechanism. So when you get too close, it activates the part of them that says, I have to disappear or I'll lose myself. But here's the thing. You didn't ask them to lose themselves. You simply invited them to meet you, to show up, to be seen, to be emotionally available. And that invitation was terrifying, because people who grew up having to suppress their emotional needs, who were punished for vulnerability, or neglected when they sought comfort, don't always know how to receive love without feeling threatened by it. And you became the mirror, a reflection of everything they've avoided. And so they ran. You didn't fail. You didn't mess it up. You weren't too intense, too expressive, too open. You were simply honest. And they weren't ready for the kind of honesty that doesn't leave room for hiding. So they disappeared. And now you understand. That wasn't about you. It was about a pattern they've lived in long before you arrived. And it's a pattern they'll keep repeating until they finally decide to face themselves. But you don't need to be the one they return to once they're ready. You can set yourself free now. The truth they'll never tell you. There's something you need to hear. Something they'll probably never say to your face. But something that lives in the silence they left behind. You meant something to them. Yes, even if they ghosted you. Even if they disappeared mid-connection. Even if they never came back to explain. They felt it. They may have buried it, avoided it, minimized it. But they felt it. And it scared them. Because avoidantly attached people often don't ghost because you didn't matter. They ghost because you did. You disrupted their emotional autopilot. You stirred something in them that they couldn't name. You made them feel seen in a way that was unfamiliar, And unfamiliar isn't always welcome to a nervous system that equates closeness with danger. They may never tell you the truth. But here it is. They didn't ghost you to punish you. They ghosted you to protect themselves. Because staying, talking, opening up, confronting their own discomfort would have required a level of emotional intimacy they weren't capable of giving. Not because they're bad people, but because that level of intimacy feels like a threat to their internal balance. So instead of risking closeness, they disappear. They choose silence over vulnerability, withdrawal over accountability, distance over dialogue. And while that may have protected them, it deeply wounded you. But here's what else they'll never say. They thought about you. They still do. Not because they're coming back, not because you should wait, but because a part of them knows they ran from something real. Avoidants don't just forget. They suppress. They compartmentalize. They convince themselves they don't need what they just had. But when the night is quiet, when no one is asking anything of them, when they scroll through memories or feel the echo of your voice in their head, they remember, not just you, but who they were when they were with you. And that's the part that haunts them. Because even if they couldn't admit it, with you, they were safer than they'd ever been. And that safety scared them more than chaos ever did. Because some people are more comfortable in crisis than in calm. They know how to fight or flee, but they don't know how to stay and feel. So when you showed up with softness, with stability, with sincerity, it didn't soothe them. It triggered them. So no, they won't tell you this. They won't send the text that says, "I ghosted you because you were everything I wanted, and that terrified me." But you don't need to hear it from them. You already know. And that knowing, that deep, embodied clarity, is what sets you free. You in the story, even if they never do. They left. And they didn't just walk out, they vanished. No warning, no closure, no moment of mutual understanding, where the two of you sat face to face and said, "This isn't working anymore." Instead, they handed you a silence so heavy it felt like punishment. And yet, you carried it like it was your fault. You examined yourself like evidence, tore apart your memory of every last moment. Did I say too much? Was I too emotional? Did I need too much? You begged your own intuition for answers it didn't have. And in that void, you made their disappearance your responsibility to decode. But now you know. You know that ghosting says nothing about your worth, and everything about their emotional limits. You know that avoidance isn't a cruelty meant to harm you. It's a coping mechanism meant to protect them. But protection, when it hurts others, becomes a weapon. And in their need to disappear, you were the casualty. You didn't deserve that. You never did. There's a moment in every healing story when you realize you've been trying to rewrite a chapter that someone else refused to finish. You've been waiting to co-author a conclusion when the other person already closed the book and walked away. And that's when the shift happens. The final, soft, sacred shift. You realize you are allowed to end the story, even if they never do. You don't need their permission. You don't need their explanation. You don't need to stay stuck in the last scene they left you in frozen, in disbelief. Because while they were gone, you grew. You changed. You became the kind of person who no longer chases ghosts, but honors her own presence. It's a strange, beautiful thing. Healing from someone who never gave you an ending. You realize the closure was never in their message. It was in your self-respect. It was in the day you finally stopped checking your phone. The day you stopped hoping the silence would break. The day you stopped confusing their absence with a mystery you were supposed to solve. Because what they didn't say was the message. What they didn't do was the decision. Their silence. It was the ending. You just hadn't accepted it yet. Now you do. And that acceptance doesn't come with rage. It doesn't come with coldness. It comes with something gentler, something far more powerful. Peace. You don't need to be colder. You just need to be clearer. This story is over. Not because they said so, but because you did. And now, you walk forward, not carrying their silence, but carrying your worth. Not wondering if they'll come back, but knowing you've already come home. To yourself.